The cold metal walls of the alien cell pulsed faintly with an eerie bioluminescent glow, casting long shadows over Ethan Calloway's rugged face. His wrists ached from the tight metallic cuffs chaining him to the wall. Days, weeks. He'd lost track of time in the dim confines of his prison aboard the Calirian warship. He'd survived brutal battles on countless worlds, but nothing had prepared him for captivity in deep space. Death he could handle. The waiting, endless, suffocating was far worse. Footsteps echoed in the corridor outside, sharp and measured, different from the usual heavy stomps of the guards. His instincts sharpened, muscles coiling like a compressed spring. The cell door hissed open with a cold hydraulic exhale. 2 Calirian enforcers, tall, armored, and expressionless, entered, their glowing, angular tattoos pulsing a menacing crimson. Ethan straightened, bracing for another round of questioning or, worse, execution. "You will come with us," one commanded in clipped galactic common. Ethan smirked grimly. "Finally bored of keeping me around, huh?" They didn't respond. Metal cuffs clamped around his wrists, and the guards hauled him to his feet with effortless strength. As they dragged him down the winding corridor, Ethan silently counted every step, mapping the ship in his head, a survival habit he'd never outgrown. They arrived at a massive set of blackened doors marked with intricate, glowing symbols. The air felt electric, charged with something more intense than the ship's energy field. The guards shoved him forward as the doors slid open. Inside was a vast chamber bathed in shimmering silver light, with walls etched in swirling, luminous patterns that pulsed in rhythmic waves. At its center stood a towering command dais, and upon it, she waited, Commander Solara Vale. Even in the harsh alien light, she was striking, imposing yet graceful, her willowy frame encased in gleaming dark armor traced with faintly glowing patterns. Her sharp, predatory gaze locked onto Ethan with the intensity of a predator sizing up its prey. Her skin shimmered with a faint violet hue, and bioluminescent tattoos snaked across her arms and neck in elaborate designs. Dim but alive, she radiated authority, dominance, power tempered by lethal control. "Leave us," she commanded coolly. The guards hesitated for only a fraction of a second before bowing and retreating without a word. The doors sealed shut behind them, leaving Ethan and Solara alone. He rolled his shoulders, testing his restraints. "If you're going to kill me, do me a favor. Make it fast." Solara descended from the dais with fluid grace, her eyes never leaving his. "If I wanted you dead, human, you'd already be ash." Her voice was low, smooth as silk, yet edged with steel. "Comforting," he drawled. "So what's this?" Interrogation. Execution with a speech first. She stopped just out of reach, studying him with unsettling intensity, her expression unreadable. For a long, charged moment, neither spoke. Her gaze lingered on his face, his broad shoulders, the scars etched into his skin like a soldier's story written in flesh. "You misunderstand," she said at last, her voice softening, but only slightly. "I need something from you." Ethan's eyes narrowed. "What could you possibly need from me?" Solara hesitated, an almost imperceptible flicker of vulnerability crossing her otherwise stoic face. Her tattoos pulsed faintly, betraying some emotion she fought to suppress. "My species requires physical contact to survive certain biological cycles," she admitted, the words strained, as though forced from her. "Our physiology demands a connection." Her gaze hardened again. "You are the only compatible specimen aboard." For a moment, Ethan thought he'd misheard her. His pulse spiked, a mix of confusion and disbelief swirling in his chest. "You've got to be kidding me. This is not a request." Her voice dropped lower, more dangerous. "Refuse, and I'll have no further use for you. Cooperation ensures your survival, and perhaps something more." The room seemed to pulse around them, charged with an electric intensity he couldn't quite explain. Ethan's mind raced, grappling with the bizarre reality unfolding before him. He was a soldier, a survivor, trained to resist, to fight. But this wasn't a fight he'd prepared for. Her gaze softened just enough that he saw the truth behind her rigid command. This wasn't just about control. She was desperate, trapped by her own biology, forced to depend on someone she clearly despised meeting. Ethan exhaled slowly, meeting her fierce, guarded eyes. "And what happens if I say yes?" Solara stepped closer, her fingers grazing the edge of his cuffs. A touch so faint it sent an involuntary shiver through him. Her tattoos flared faintly at the contact, shimmering like living constellations against her skin. "Then we survive," she whispered. Together. Ethan's wrists ached where the alien cuffs still bit into his skin, though the sting was the least of his concerns. His mind reeled as Commander Solara Vale's words echoed through him. She needed something from him. Something personal, intimate, and far beyond anything he had imagined when he was dragged from his cell. He stared at her, still processing the impossible request. Her unreadable violet eyes held his with unwavering intensity. Yet there was something beneath that icy authority. A fracture in her composure, subtle but undeniable. Desperation, maybe. Vulnerability carefully masked by command. "If I refuse?" he asked slowly, voice rough. Her tattoos dimmed slightly, like a dying flame. "Then your life ends here." She paused, expression tightening. "But if you agree, you will be treated with dignity." Her voice softened, just enough to betray something deeper. "Regret, perhaps. I will not force you, but my offer is final." Ethan clenched his jaw, anger warring with survival instinct. He hated feeling cornered, stripped of control. But he'd been a soldier long enough to know when surrender was the only way forward. His survival instinct kicked in hard, even as suspicion gnawed at his gut. "You're really that desperate?" he asked, searching her face for any sign of deceit. Her eyes flashed, offended. "This is not desperation. It is necessity." Her voice was sharp again, the cool detachment snapping back into place. "My kind suppress emotions. We are stronger because of it. But even strength has limits." He considered her words, his mind working through possibilities. He was alive because she needed him. If he played along, maybe he could turn the situation to his advantage. Escape might still be possible. "Fine," he said grimly. "But I'm not doing this as your toy. No games." Solara inclined her head slowly, acknowledging his terms. "Agreed." Before he could say anything more, she lifted her hand, fingers tracing the air near his wrist. With a faint hum, the cuffs disengaged and clattered to the floor. Ethan fought the urge to rub his sore wrists, keeping his stance steady, alert. Her trust in releasing him was minimal, but it was a start. "Follow me," she ordered, already turning toward a side entrance he hadn't noticed before. Her armor caught the strange, shifting light as she moved, gleaming like tempered steel infused with molten stars. Ethan hesitated but followed, his every sense on high alert. They walked in silence down a long, softly lit corridor etched with the same swirling symbols he'd seen before, like a living mural pulsing faintly with inner light. They entered a private chamber far removed from the stark, utilitarian halls of the warship. The walls shimmered with cool blues and silvers, casting an almost serene glow. A curved viewport displayed a breathtaking view of deep space, scattered with distant, burning stars. He didn't have long to admire the view. Solara faced him, shoulders squared. But there was something almost uncertain about her now, as though standing here stripped away some of her practiced authority. The dim bioluminescent lines tracing her skin pulsed faintly with each measured breath she took. "This space is private," she said, her voice softer now, more personal. "We will not be disturbed." Ethan crossed his arms, masking his tension. "So, how does this work?" For a moment, she didn't answer, studying him with that same penetrating intensity he couldn't shake. Then she stepped closer, her hands lowering slowly to her sides, armor panels retracting with soft clicks until only a thin, form-fitting bodysuit remained, its dark fabric shimmering like woven starlight. Her tattoos shimmered brighter against her skin, faint streaks of violet and silver tracing elegant, flowing patterns like ancient cosmic scripts. "It requires contact," she said, voice barely above a whisper now, her eyes locked on his. "Your touch awakens the process. Without it, she faltered, an admission she clearly hated making. I cannot survive this cycle. The vulnerability in her words hit harder than Ethan expected. For all her commanding presence, for all her strength, she was bound by something primal,
Slow step forward.
something she couldn't control, closing the distance between them. So what happens if we try? Her tattoos flared faintly, betraying a flicker of anticipation or something deeper. We synchronize. If it works. Ethan hesitated for only a breath longer before lifting his hand. His fingers brushed her forearm, tentative but firm, testing her reaction. Her skin was warm, almost impossibly soft, faintly electric beneath his touch. Her breath hitched, eyes widening just slightly as the glowing lines of her tattoos surged with sudden brilliance, rippling like liquid fire. She didn't pull away. Slowly, she placed her hand over his, her touch steady but trembling just enough to betray how uncharted this was for her. Her tattoos flared again, responding to contact like living conduits of light, tracing new patterns he couldn't begin to understand. Their eyes met, and for the first time, there was no command, no power struggle, just something raw, intense, and deeply personal. In that charged, breathless moment, words felt unnecessary. Touch was its own language here. Solara exhaled softly, and for the first time, the weight of control seemed to fall away from her rigid frame. Ethan could see it, the careful mask cracking, vulnerability finally breaking free. But even as the intensity built, something dark stirred at the edge of Ethan's thoughts. A survival instinct still screaming that this fragile connection couldn't last. Not aboard this warship. Not in the heart of enemy territory. And certainly not with someone like her. For now, though, survival and surrender felt dangerously intertwined, and there was no turning back. Ethan's breath steadied, though his pulse still pounded as he held Solara's gaze. Her hand remained over his, slender fingers trembling just enough that he could feel it. Despite her earlier command, she wasn't as in control as she wanted him to believe. Her tattoos pulsed faintly beneath his touch, shimmering with unpredictable flashes of light. Alive, reactive, almost emotional. For the first time she seemed uncertain, vulnerable even. The fierce, commanding war leader was gone, replaced by someone who clearly struggled with being this exposed. He knew the signs. He'd lived through war, betrayal, and survival. But there was something raw in her hesitation that unsettled him. He spoke quietly. Is this working? Solara's gaze flickered down to where their hands touched. The tattoos tracing her skin glowed faintly but inconsistently, as though unsure of how to respond. She took a slow, steadying breath. Not yet, she admitted, her voice softer now, stripped of its usual command. It requires synchronization. Ethan frowned. Synchronization? You said this was just contact. Her jaw tightened. It is deeper than that. Her eyes met his again, colder now, as if trying to regain lost control. Your body responds instinctively, but mine does not. Emotion is a liability for my kind. Suppressing it is survival. He nodded slowly, the pieces starting to fall into place. But that's the problem, isn't it? You can't suppress it now. Solara stiffened at his words, but she didn't deny it. Her tattoos pulsed faintly, betraying her agitation. Ethan shifted his stance, letting his hands rest at his sides. He wasn't sure why he softened his voice when he spoke next. Habit, maybe, or something more dangerous. So, how do we fix it? For a long moment, she said nothing. Her expression remained steeled, but her eyes, intense, striking, flickered with something fragile, something she clearly hated showing. Her fingers grazed his forearm again, almost tentative this time, tracing faint patterns over his skin. Her touch sent a faint shiver through him, surprising in its warmth and delicacy. We try again, she said quietly. He nodded and slowly raised his hand, letting his fingertips brush along the edge of her palm. Her breath hitched just slightly, though she held his gaze with fierce determination. This time, he didn't hold back. He cupped her hand firmly, fingers intertwining with hers. The soft hum of her tattoos intensified at the contact, sending shimmering waves of light spiraling up her arm. Ethan marveled at the way her tattoos seemed to react. Not mechanically, but almost emotionally, like living circuitry responding to her pulse, her breath, her will. The light flared brighter when he drew her closer, until they were standing just inches apart. "Is that better?" he asked, voice low. Solara's expression softened despite herself. "Yes." Before either could speak again, she lifted her other hand and traced a light path along his shoulder, the faintest pressure of her fingers grazing his collarbone. Her touch left a faint, electric warmth in its wake, and her bioluminescent markings responded with soft, rippling light, like water touched by wind. Ethan inhaled sharply, not from pain but something far more intense. He could feel the connection growing, not just physical but something deeper, more primal. He wasn't sure if it was her alien physiology, his survival instinct, or something far more dangerous pulling him closer. Solara's gaze softened further, her defenses crumbling in increments. Her hand rested against his chest, her breathing uneven now. "Your presence strengthens the bond," she murmured, her voice trembling just enough to betray her uncertainty. "Then let it happen," Ethan said gently, lowering his head until their foreheads nearly touched. "Stop fighting it." Her breath hitched again, and this time, she didn't pull away. The tattoos along her neck and shoulders surged with sudden brilliance, illuminating the soft planes of her face in shimmering violet and silver. Before either could question the moment, she closed the distance between them. Her lips brushed his, not a command, not a calculated move, but something tentative, uncertain, almost searching. Ethan froze, shocked by the sudden intimacy, but quickly surrendered to the warmth of her touch. Their kiss deepened slowly, naturally, fueled by a shared need neither could fully understand but couldn't deny. Her fingers curled into his shirt as she leaned closer, her body trembling against his, overwhelmed but unwilling to stop. His hands settled at her waist, grounding them both as the connection between them flared, almost tangible now. For the first time, Solara allowed herself to surrender, not to weakness but to something real, something hers. The glowing tattoos that traced her body shimmered brighter than ever, pulsing in radiant waves of light. They broke apart only when breath became necessary, their foreheads resting together, breaths mingling in the charged stillness between them. "I didn't expect that," Solara admitted, voice barely above a whisper. "Neither did I," Ethan confessed. But before the fragile moment could settle, a harsh, mechanical chime echoed through the chamber, shattering the stillness. Solara's eyes snapped open, her expression instantly hardening as reality came crashing back. "Someone's coming?" she hissed, stepping back, her tattoos dimming instantly as she regained her composure. Ethan's survival instincts kicked in as he clenched his fists, already calculating possible escape routes. Whatever they'd just started was far from over. But now, survival came first. The harsh mechanical chime reverberated through the chamber, shattering the fragile stillness between Ethan and Solara. Instinct kicked in immediately. Solara stepped back, her bioluminescent tattoos dimming to an almost imperceptible glow as her face hardened back into the cold, commanding expression he'd first encountered. Ethan clenched his fists, already scanning the room for potential exits or weapons. His survival instincts told him that whoever was coming wouldn't appreciate what had just happened, or how far things had progressed between them. Solara's voice was sharp and low. "Stay behind me. Do not speak unless I command it." Before he could respond, the chamber doors hissed open with a sharp mechanical whine. Two heavily armed Calirian guards entered, their glowing tattoos pulsing a harsh crimson that marked them as enforcers of the ship's law. Between them strode a tall, severe-looking alien male, his posture rigid with authority. His tattoos burned with a more intense light, flickering in sharp, angular patterns that reminded Ethan of a blade about to strike. "Commander Vale," the male intoned, his voice cold and clipped. His piercing gaze flicked briefly toward Ethan, though his expression betrayed no recognition of the human significance. "You've been difficult to reach." Solara straightened, her expression as rigid as steel. I was engaged in critical recalibration. What is the meaning of this intrusion? Subcommander Varric. Varric's eyes narrowed slightly, his tattoos flaring as though reading her body language. Recalibration. His gaze lingered on Ethan just long enough to register thinly veiled disdain. With him, Solara didn't flinch. His presence is required for compatibility testing. His biological responses are adequate. Ethan clenched his jaw, biting back a retort. He'd seen power games like this before, military officers posturing for dominance, but the stakes felt far more dangerous now. He forced himself to remain still, watching Varric's every move. The subcommander took a slow step closer, his tattoos rippling like living fire. Strange. The High Council expressed concerns about distractions. His gaze bored into Solara's, sharp and predatory. You have never been prone to weakness unchanged, though her shoulders tensed ever so slightly. My actions are dictated by necessity, not emotion. You would be wise to remember that. Their silent standoff stretched unbearably long before Varric finally inclined his head, though his expression remained cold and calculating. See that it stays that way, he warned, his voice low and threatening. He gestured sharply to his guards. Resume your duties. This inspection is concluded. The guards stepped back in unison, their glowing tattoos flickering like warning beacons as they retreated. Varric followed but paused just before the door, his piercing gaze locking onto Ethan one last time. Humans are unpredictable, he said slowly, almost thoughtfully. Be certain he does not compromise your mission. With that final, cutting remark, he turned and strode out, the doors sealing shut behind him with a menacing hiss. Ethan exhaled, tension bleeding from his shoulders as he took an instinctive step closer to Solara. Friend of yours? He asked dryly. Solara remained still, her gaze fixed on the now closed doors. For a moment she didn't answer. Then, slowly, she turned toward him, her expression carefully guarded, but not entirely cold. He suspects more than he let on, she said, voice tight. Varric has always sought to replace me. Ethan nodded slowly, piecing together the dangerous political game unfolding aboard the warship. If he finds out about this, he gestured between them. You're finished. Solara's eyes narrowed. If he finds out, we're both dead. The gravity of her words sank in fast. Whatever fragile bond they'd started to form wasn't just dangerous. It was fatal. And yet, despite everything, Ethan couldn't shake the memory of her touch. The way her tattoos had flared beneath his fingers, alive and electric with something beyond survival. We need a plan, he said firmly. If he's watching you this closely, it's only a matter of time before he makes his move. Solara's tattoos flickered faintly, betraying her tension before she could suppress it. Agreed. Ethan stepped closer, lowering his voice. Then let me help. Whatever this connection is between us, it's real. Use it. Use me. Her eyes widened just slightly, as though the sincerity in his offer caught her off guard. But she didn't step back this time. This will not be easy, she warned. Trust is not something I can give lightly. Ethan met her gaze steadily. I'm not asking for trust, just a chance. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then, slowly, she extended her hand, not as a command, but as an equal offering. Ethan clasped it without hesitation, feeling the familiar warmth of her skin against his, the faint pulse of light trailing up her arm like liquid starlight. Together, then, she said quietly, before either could second-guess the fragile alliance forming between them. The ship's warning sirens blared, a sharp, resonant call that echoed through the halls like a deadly promise. Solara's expression turned cold and fierce once more as she released his hand, already moving toward the control panel embedded in the chamber's wall. The glowing alien symbols shifted rapidly as she scanned incoming reports, her tattoos flaring brighter with urgency. They've declared a combat alert, she said grimly. Something, or someone, has triggered the external defenses. Ethan's heart pounded as possibilities raced through his mind. Whatever was coming, it would either be their chance to escape, or the end of everything they'd just begun. The blaring combat alert echoed through the ship's metallic corridors like a heartbeat of war. Ethan's muscles coiled instinctively, the familiar sounds sparking memories of countless battlefields. He moved closer to Solara, who was already at the control panel, her sharp eyes scanning rapidly shifting alien symbols that pulsed across the glowing interface. "What's happening?" he demanded, keeping his voice low but firm. "An unidentified vessel breached our outer perimeter," Solara answered, her tone clipped, all traces of vulnerability gone. Her bioluminescent tattoos flared with intensity, reflecting her rising tension. "They've engaged the ship's defense grid. Hostile. Unknown," she admitted, her fingers flying over the control interface. "But this ship's orders are clear. Anything not authorized is treated as an enemy." Ethan cursed under his breath. His mind raced, considering possibilities. A rescue mission was unlikely. No one from Earth knew he was alive, much less on a hostile warship in deep space. This was something else entirely. Before he could voice another thought, the ship rocked violently, sending him stumbling into the nearest wall. He caught himself, but the impact reverberated through the deck like a distant explosion. Solara's expression hardened. "Direct hit on Deck 12. Hull breach detected. We need to move," Ethan urged, his instincts kicking in. "Staying here makes us sitting targets." Solara hesitated for only a fraction of a second before nodding. "Follow me." She led him out of the chamber, moving with lethal grace through the narrow corridors of the warship. Ethan kept pace, scanning every shadowed corner for potential threats. The distant sounds of weapons fire echoed through the halls, sharp, metallic bursts that sent adrenaline surging through his veins. They passed several armored Calirian soldiers rushing toward the source of the commotion, their glowing tattoos blazing crimson with combat readiness. None of them spared Ethan a second glance, clearly focused on the external threat. "This breach, could it be internal sabotage?" Ethan asked as they turned sharply down another corridor. "Unlikely," Solara replied without slowing. "The ship's security protocols are too advanced. It would require someone high-ranking, or something powerful enough to bypass our defenses." Her meaning was clear, though she didn't say it out loud. If Varric was behind this, they were already in deeper danger than she'd feared. They reached a secondary control station deep within the ship's core, where the walls glowed faintly with streams of alien data, cascading like digital waterfalls. Solara activated the central display, bringing up a projection of the battle outside. Ethan's breath caught. A massive, angular warship loomed just beyond the Calirian vessel's perimeter. A dark, jagged behemoth bristling with heavy weaponry and shimmering shields. Its design was utterly alien, unlike anything he'd encountered before. "That's not one of yours," he said grimly. "No," Solara confirmed, her voice tight, "and it's not one of your human fleets either." The hostile vessel unleashed another devastating volley of plasma fire, slamming into the Calirian warship's shields with brutal precision. Ethan watched as entire sections of the warship's outer hull buckled under the relentless assault. "What's their objective?" he asked. "Boarding? Destruction?" Solara's gaze narrowed. "Neither." She tapped several glyphs, enhancing the display. "They're targeting the engine core. They intend to disable us." "Why not just destroy the ship?" Ethan wondered aloud. "They want something on board." Solara's expression darkened. "Or someone." Before either could react, an emergency proximity alarm blared through the station. The screen shifted, highlighting several rapidly approaching heat signatures. "They've launched boarding craft," Solara hissed. "They'll breach the lower decks in minutes." Ethan clenched his fists, already calculating their next move. "If they want something on board, we can use that." Her eyes flicked toward him, sharp with understanding. "You're suggesting we make ourselves the target," Ethan said firmly. "Draw them away from the engine core. Give your crew a fighting chance." Solara hesitated for only a second before nodding, her tattoos flaring with renewed intensity. It's a reckless plan. Reckless is all I've got. She allowed herself a small, fierce smile, almost approval, before turning back to the control panel. There's an access route through Maintenance Sector 7. Lightly guarded. Direct path to the lower decks. Then let's move. Before they could leave, a sharp, static-laced voice crackled over the ship's internal comm system. Varric's voice, cold and commanding. Attention all personnel. Priority target detected in Sector 7. Intercept and detain at all costs. Ethan and Solara locked eyes. They know, Ethan growled. Without another word, they bolted down the corridor, racing against time. The walls pulsed red with emergency lights, casting flickering shadows that twisted and writhed like living things. The ship shuddered again under another blast, forcing them to brace against the nearest wall. Solara yanked a sleek, curved energy weapon from a nearby emergency cache and tossed it to Ethan without breaking stride. "Know how to use one of these?" she asked sharply. He caught it with practiced ease, checking its charge with an experienced flick of his wrist. Point, shoot, survive. Her faint smirk returned for only a second before vanishing beneath her hardened combat focus. As they neared the lower decks, the distant sounds of combat grew louder: shouts, weapons fire, the sharp hiss of plasma cutting through steel. Ethan's grip tightened around the weapon, every nerve in his body primed for a fight. They rounded the last corner and came face to face with a squad of heavily armed Calirian enforcers, their glowing tattoos blazing with hostile intent. Then all hell broke loose. The instant Ethan saw the armed Calirian enforcers blocking their path, his body reacted on instinct. He snapped his weapon up, aiming for the nearest soldier, even as his mind raced through survival calculations. 5 of them, fully armored, glowing tattoos flaring crimson, combat ready and deadly. His chances weren't good. Solara was already moving. With a sharp command in her native tongue, she lunged, her sleek combat blade flashing with lethal precision. The closest enforcer barely raised his weapon before her strike connected, a deadly arc of violet energy slicing through his armor. He collapsed with a guttural cry, tattoos flickering and fading to darkness. The remaining 4 scattered into combat formation, their weapons blazing in a hail of deadly plasma fire. Ethan dove behind a nearby support column as energy bolts seared the walls around him, leaving scorched metal scars in their wake. He returned fire with sharp, calculated bursts, aiming for the narrow gaps between their armor plating. Solara moved like a living weapon, graceful and deadly. She was already on the next enforcer, spinning low and sweeping his legs out from under him before driving her blade into his exposed neck. His tattoos sputtered, fading instantly. 2 left, Ethan shouted, rising from cover long enough to drop another enforcer with a precise headshot. The alien crumpled with a sharp, metallic thud. The last soldier rushed Solara, swinging a crackling energy staff in a wide, lethal arc. She parried with her blade but was driven back by the sheer force of the blow. Her feet skidded across the metal deck, her tattoos flaring with combat intensity. Ethan surged forward, weapon raised, but before he could fire, the enforcer twisted sharply, disarming Solara with a brutal strike that sent her blade clattering across the floor. "Commander Vale, surrender now," the enforcer barked, his weapon aimed directly at her chest. "By order of Subcommander Varric, you are under arrest." Ethan didn't hesitate. He closed the distance in 2 long strides, grabbing the enforcer from behind and slamming the butt of his weapon into the back of the alien's head with bone-cracking force. The enforcer crumpled, unconscious, his tattoos dimming to lifeless black. Breathing hard, Ethan straightened, weapon still raised, scanning the corridor for more hostiles. For a moment, only the distant echoes of battle and the hum of the ship's damaged systems filled the silence. Solara retrieved her fallen blade, nodding in grim acknowledgement. "We need to keep moving. Varric won't stop until we're captured, or dead." "No argument here," Ethan muttered, wiping sweat from his brow. His pulse still pounded from the fight, but there was no time to recover. They had to move. They sprinted down the flickering, battle-scarred corridor toward the maintenance sector's lower levels. Emergency lights pulsed dimly overhead, casting shifting shadows that seemed to twist and writhe in the metallic haze. Every step felt heavier, tension thrumming between them like a taut wire ready to snap. Solara's voice cut through the silence. "You fought well." Ethan glanced sideways at her. "You sound surprised." "I've seen humans fight before," she admitted. "Reckless, unpredictable." Her tattoos dimmed slightly, almost thoughtfully. "But you adapt." "Survival's what I do," Ethan replied, keeping his gaze fixed ahead. "Not much choice when the odds are always stacked against you." Her expression tightened, but she said nothing more. They reached a sealed blast door at the end of the corridor, blocking their only escape route. Solara quickly accessed the control panel, her fingers flying over glowing alien glyphs that pulsed with stubborn resistance. "Hurry," Ethan urged, keeping his weapon trained on the corridor behind them. His gut twisted with the uneasy certainty that more enforcers or something worse were coming. "Override protocols are locked," Solara growled, slamming her fist against the panel in frustration. "Varric must have sealed this entire sector. Then we find another way." Before he could finish, the ship shuddered violently beneath their feet, sending them both staggering. A deep, mechanical groan reverberated through the hull, followed by a series of deafening explosions. The lights flickered, then dimmed entirely, leaving only the faint, pulsing glow of Solara's tattoos to pierce the darkness. "What the hell was that?" Ethan demanded, straining to stay upright as the floor buckled beneath them. "Main power grid disabled," Solara hissed, her voice tight with frustration. "The boarding party must have reached the reactor core." Ethan cursed under his breath. "We're out of time." Before either could react, the blast door behind them groaned and hissed, its emergency locks disengaging with a metallic shriek. Ethan spun, weapon raised, but what stood beyond the threshold wasn't another squad of Calirian enforcers. It was Varric. The sub-commander stepped through the ruined blast door with predatory calm, flanked by two heavily armored enforcers whose tattoos burned a fierce, searing red. His own markings pulsed in sharp, angular patterns that radiated cold, calculated malice. "Commander Vale," Varric intoned, his voice a blade of ice. "Your defiance ends here." Solara moved instantly, stepping between Ethan and Varric with lethal precision, her blade gleaming in the dim light. "Your ambition blinds you, Varric," she spat. "You've doomed us all." He smiled, a cold, cruel expression devoid of warmth. "You've already sealed your fate. Surrender now, and I may allow the human to die quickly." Ethan's grip tightened on his weapon, teeth clenched, ready for a final fight. But before he could act, a sudden, blinding surge of energy erupted from Varric's outstretched hand. An electric, crackling force that slammed into both of them with crushing power. Pain exploded through Ethan's chest as he was thrown back, hitting the cold, metal deck with bone-jarring force. His weapon skidded out of reach, lost in the haze of smoke and flickering emergency lights. His vision blurred, and the last thing he saw before darkness claimed him was Solara's face, her glowing tattoos burning bright with fierce, desperate defiance. Right before she lunged toward Varric, unyielding to the very end. Pain radiated through Ethan's chest as he struggled to pull himself back to consciousness. His vision flickered, blurring with each strained breath. Cold metal pressed against his back, the sharp tang of burnt circuitry lingering in the air. Distant echoes of combat rumbled through the warship's shattered hulls, a constant reminder that the battle was far from over. With a groan, he forced his body to move, biting back the searing pain in his ribs. He pushed himself onto his elbows, blinking against the dim emergency lighting. His eyes swept the ruined corridor, searching desperately. Where was Solara? A sudden surge of light drew his gaze. Across the corridor, Varric loomed, his bioluminescent tattoos burning in jagged, blood-red patterns that pulsed with cruel precision. He stood over Solara's restrained form, one armored boot pressing her blade out of reach. Two heavily armed Calirian enforcers held her pinned between them, forcing her to her knees. Her defiant gaze never wavered, despite the bruises marring her sharp features and the faint tremor in her shoulders. "You should have surrendered when you had the chance," Varric sneered, his voice cold and triumphant. "Your reckless defiance has cost you everything." Solara bared her teeth, her tattoos flaring in defiant bursts of violet light. "You've already lost, Varric. You just don't see it yet." Varric's eyes narrowed, his expression twisting with contempt. He raised his hand, energy crackling dangerously along his fingertips. A clear, deadly warning. Ethan moved before he could think, adrenaline surging through his battered body. He lunged toward the discarded weapon he'd seen just out of reach, ignoring the searing pain in his ribs. His fingers closed around the grip just as Varric unleashed a searing arc of energy aimed directly at Solara. With a desperate shout, Ethan rolled into a crouch and fired. The energy blast struck Varric's outstretched hand, forcing him back with a snarl of pain. His tattoos flared violently, shifting into jagged, chaotic patterns as he reeled from the unexpected attack. The enforcers holding Solara hesitated just long enough. Solara surged upward, twisting sharply out of their grip. Her hands snapped toward her fallen blade, reclaiming it in a fluid motion as she spun with lethal precision. The first enforcer went down with a swift, merciless slash, collapsing into a heap of dim tattoos and shattered armor. The second enforcer lunged at Ethan, his energy staff crackling with destructive force. Ethan dodged the first swing by inches, the heat from the weapon grazing his arm. He retaliated with a sharp, well-aimed shot, the plasma bolt striking the enforcer's exposed neck. The alien dropped with a strangled cry. Ethan stumbled toward Solara, his grip steady on his weapon despite the sharp ache radiating through his side. "Solara," he called hoarsely. Their eyes met, fierce determination flashing between them. But the moment shattered as Varric rose, his tattoos blazing with furious intensity. He thrust both hands outward, unleashing a crackling surge of raw power that rippled through the corridor like a living storm. "Enough!" Varric roared, his voice echoing with electric force. "You will not escape." The blast struck the walls with explosive force, sending shards of molten metal raining down. Ethan barely had time to shield himself before the entire deck shuddered violently, groaning under the assault. Solara surged toward Ethan, grabbing his wrist. "We have to move now." Before he could argue, she pulled him toward a side passage partially hidden by debris. They sprinted through the narrow corridor, the flickering emergency lights casting sharp, shifting shadows across their path. Behind them, Varric's enraged shouts echoed like a hunter's call, relentless and cold. They didn't stop until they reached a secure maintenance shaft several decks lower, shielded from the main combat zones. Ethan collapsed against the wall, gasping for breath, every muscle burning with exertion. Solara stood guard near the corridor entrance, blade still drawn, her tattoos flickering with residual tension. Only when she was sure they were alone did she lower her weapon, her shoulders sagging ever so slightly. Ethan wiped sweat from his brow, wincing as he pressed a bruised rib. "You good?" Solara nodded stiffly, though her breathing remained shallow. "We bought time, but not much." He pushed himself upright, grimacing. "We can't outrun him forever." "No," she agreed, her voice low and fierce. "We end this, or we die." Their eyes met again, raw understanding passing between them. Neither had expected to survive this long, much less fight side by side. And yet, against all odds, they had endured. Solara took a hesitant step closer, her expression unreadable. Her tattoos pulsed faintly with something softer. Not weakness, but trust. "You could have left me," she said quietly. "You could have escaped." Ethan scoffed, shaking his head. "Yeah, well, running's not really my thing." Her lips quirked in the faintest trace of a smile, though it faded quickly under the weight of their reality. Her hand brushed his arm, light, tentative, but enough to ground them both in the shared, fleeting moment. "I will not let him take you," she vowed, her voice steel-edged and fierce. Ethan gently clasped her hand, his fingers tightening around hers. "We get through this together." For a moment, there was only stillness between them. A fragile, burning intensity that neither could fully explain but couldn't deny. Then, slowly, Solara released his hand, her gaze steady. Then let's finish this. Without another word, they turned back toward the battlefield, toward the fight that would decide everything. The maintenance shaft stale. Metallic air clung to Ethan's skin as he and Solara moved with silent precision through the narrow passageway. Each step echoed faintly, mixing with the distant hum of the damaged warship's failing systems. They both knew time was running out. The Calirian vessel wouldn't survive much longer under the relentless assault from the unknown enemy ship, and neither would they if Varric found them first. Solara led the way, her sharp gaze scanning every junction with deadly focus. Her bioluminescent tattoos pulsed faintly, a steady, determined rhythm against her skin. Ethan followed close behind, gripping the stolen plasma weapon he'd grown accustomed to. Every nerve in his body remained tense, ready for the inevitable fight that loomed ahead. They reached a dimly lit access chamber deep in the lower decks, hidden from the ship's main surveillance systems. It was far from safe, but it was secure enough to give them a momentary reprieve. Ethan leaned heavily against the wall, his breath ragged from exertion and lingering pain. Solara activated a nearby control panel, locking the heavy blast door behind them with a hiss of hydraulics. The alien glyphs flickered uncertainly on the failing screen, but the door held. For now. Ethan exhaled slowly, wincing as he pressed a bruised rib. That won't keep him out for long. No, Solara agreed, her voice low but resolute. But it will slow him down. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The faint hum of the warship's damaged engines vibrated through the floor, a grim reminder of how little time they had left. They couldn't stay hidden, not with Varric hunting them and the ship on the verge of collapse. Ethan studied Solara as she checked her remaining weapons with practiced efficiency. Her expression remained coldly focused, but he could see the strain in her tense shoulders, the faint tremor she tried to suppress. "You're pushing too hard," he said quietly, stepping closer. "I have no choice." Her voice was sharp, defensive, but there was something deeper beneath it. "This fight doesn't end until he's dead. Or we are." Ethan hesitated, then gently rested his hand over hers, stilling her restless movements. Her breath hitched, her eyes snapping up to meet his, fierce and unyielding, but not pulling away. "You're not alone in this," he said firmly. "Whatever happens, we face it together." Her expression wavered, the hard edges softening just enough to let something real shine through. Her fingers curled faintly against his palm. Not a warrior's grip, but something more fragile, more human. For a moment, she let herself breathe. "I fought alone my entire life," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I never expected this." Ethan's gaze softened, his thumb tracing a faint, reassuring line across her knuckles. "Neither did I." Their shared intensity hung between them, heavy and undeniable. Slowly, Solara stepped closer, her hand rising to rest lightly against his chest, just above his racing heartbeat. Her tattoos pulsed softly, faint streaks of light rippling in gentle, unspoken response. Ethan's hand lifted, brushing a stray lock of shimmering violet hair from her face. His fingertips lingered against her skin, warm and electric, drawn by a gravity he couldn't resist. She didn't pull away. Their foreheads touched, breaths mingling in the charged stillness that crackled between them. Her eyes searched his, fierce and vulnerable all at once, as though daring him to break the fragile connection, or hold it forever. And then she kissed him. It wasn't desperate or demanding. It was real, raw. Her lips were warm, searching, filled with all the intensity she could never put into words. Ethan's hands slid gently to her waist, holding her close as he returned the kiss with equal fervor, meeting her fire with steady, unyielding strength. For that stolen, perfect moment, the universe fell away. No war, no enemies, no deadly pursuits. Just them, bound together by something neither of them could explain, but both understood. When they finally broke apart, breathless and still holding on, her tattoos shimmered softly, pulsing in radiant patterns unlike anything he'd seen before. Her expression held a mix of fierce resolve and quiet wonder, alive in a way he'd never imagined. Before either could speak, the ship shuddered violently, snapping them back to harsh reality. The emergency lights flickered, and distant explosions reverberated through the warship's fractured hull. Solara stepped back, her expression shifting back into command, though the warmth in her gaze lingered just a moment longer. "We have to move," she said, voice steadier now. "If Varric reaches the command core first, there won't be a ship left to fight for." Ethan nodded, his grip tightening around his weapon. "Then we finish this." Without another word, they turned toward the maintenance exit, ready to face whatever came next. Together, the warship groaned like a wounded beast, its battered hull shuddering under the relentless assault from the enemy vessel. Emergency sirens blared through the flickering corridors, adding to the chaotic symphony of distant explosions and failing systems. Ethan and Solara moved as one, their steps synchronized by necessity, driven by shared purpose. The path to the command core twisted through ruined maintenance tunnels and shattered passageways littered with scorched debris. Ethan kept his plasma weapon at the ready, his body tense, every instinct honed from years of survival. Beside him, Solara led with unwavering focus, her combat blade gleaming faintly in the emergency light, her tattoos glowing with fierce determination. They reached the final access junction leading to the command core central chamber. The massive reinforced doors stood sealed, shimmering faintly with residual power from the warship's failing energy grid. Solara moved to the control panel, her fingers flying over the alien glyphs etched into the damaged interface. Sparks crackled as the system resisted her commands. "Can you override it?" Ethan asked, keeping his weapon trained on the darkened corridor behind them. "I can try," she answered grimly, her voice steady despite the urgency. "The security protocols are heavily encrypted," tattoos pulsed but I know that she worked, feeding commands into the system with practiced precision. Ethan kept scanning the hull, every sense on edge. They were too close now. Varric wouldn't leave the command core unguarded. A sudden, metallic clang echoed from the corridor behind them. Ethan whirled, weapon raised, but it was too late. From the shadows emerged a squad of heavily armed Calirian enforcers, their tattoos blazing with lethal intensity. Their energy weapons crackled ominously as they spread out, cutting off any retreat. Solara cursed under her breath, drawing her blade and stepping into a defensive stance beside Ethan. "Surround them," barked the lead enforcer, his voice cold and merciless. Ethan and Solara stood back to back, their gazes locking for a brief, fierce moment of shared understanding. No retreat, no surrender. The enforcers attacked. Ethan fired with brutal efficiency, each shot precise and lethal. His plasma bolt struck true, cutting through armor seams and exposed weak points with deadly precision. Solara moved with unmatched grace, her blade flashing in lethal arcs that left no room for hesitation. Together, they became a deadly storm of fire and steel. One by one, the enforcers fell, but not without cost. Ethan's ribs burned with every strained breath, and Solara's blade arm trembled from sheer exhaustion, though her strikes never faltered. As the last enforcer collapsed in a heap of scorched metal and dim tattoos, the air thickened with sudden, unnatural stillness. Then the door to the command core hissed open. Varric stood on the threshold, his tattoos blazing in sharp, furious lines of crimson and black. His expression twisted with cruel satisfaction as he stepped into the ruined corridor, flanked by two towering, mechanized sentinels, battle constructs bristling with deadly plasma weaponry. "It's over," Varric declared, his voice cold and triumphant. "You fought well. For traitors." Ethan steadied his weapon, aiming squarely at Varric's chest. "Still breathing, aren't we?" Varric sneered. "Not for long." The sentinels charged their weapons, plasma cannons glowing with deadly light. But before they could fire, Solara hurled her combat blade with lightning speed. The blade struck the control module on the nearest sentinel's neck, sending it into violent spasms of electrical discharge. "Now," Solara shouted. Ethan fired without hesitation, his plasma bolts punching through the exposed joints of the second sentinel. Sparks exploded as the machine staggered, circuits failing in a cascade of shattered metal. But Varric was already moving. He surged forward with inhuman speed, his tattoos blazing like molten fire as he unleashed a devastating arc of energy that crackled through the air. Ethan barely dove aside as the blast scorched the floor where he'd stood seconds before. Solara met Varric head-on, striking with deadly precision despite her exhaustion. Blades clashed in a flurry of sparks and steel, their combat illuminated by the ship's failing emergency lights. Varric's strikes were brutal, relentless, fueled by rage and twisted ambition. But Solara fought with unmatched precision, every movement driven by fierce purpose. Ethan scrambled to his feet, firing precise bursts to keep Varric off balance. But the subcommander was too fast, deflecting plasma bolts with vicious energy strikes. With a snarl, Varric caught Solara's wrist, twisting sharply until her blade clattered to the floor. She gasped in pain but didn't yield, driving her knee into his armored torso with brutal force. Ethan surged forward, tackling Varric from behind and driving him into the scorched deck. They grappled fiercely, exchanging brutal punches until Varric unleashed another crackling energy blast that sent Ethan crashing into the far wall. Gasping for air, breathing raggedly, Solara retrieved her fallen blade, her tattoos blazing in defiant brilliance as she faced Varric once more. Blood streaked her temple, her breath coming in sharp, strained gasps, but she stood unyielding. "You will fail," she hissed through clenched teeth. Varric's sneer twisted with fury, his tattoos blazing with unstable, chaotic energy. He lunged, but Solara pivoted, using his momentum against him. With a final, savage strike, she drove her blade deep into his exposed chest, piercing the core of his power. Varric staggered, his tattoos dimming in flickering, broken pulses. His breath hitched in a strangled gasp as he collapsed to the ruined deck, lifeless. For a long, harrowing moment, silence reigned. Breathing hard, Ethan pushed himself upright, every muscle screaming in protest. He staggered towards Solara, catching her just as she swayed on her feet from sheer exhaustion. Their eyes met, alive, together. "It's over," Ethan rasped, his voice rough but steady. Solara nodded faintly, her hand tightening around his, grounding them both. "We survived." The distant hum of the warship's engines shuddered violently once more, signaling its final, inevitable collapse. "Not for long," Ethan said grimly. "We need to move." Together, they stumbled toward the warship's final escape craft, a battered, forgotten vessel hidden deep within the maintenance bay. With failing power and failing strength, they launched into the dark expanse of space, leaving behind the shattered warship and the ghosts of everything they'd endured. In the endless void beyond flesh and stars, they were finally free,